Hey there, my name's Michael Patterson. I'm going to be giving you the online lectures for Biology 232, Human Anatomy and Physiology. I may or may not be your instructor, depending on what section you have, but I'll be going through all the lectures when we're in this online environment. So I'm going to be using the lecture notes. You can find those on your Moodle homepage, and we're going to be starting with muscles. Muscles are chapter 9. So if you have the e-text, you can go to chapter 9, or if you have your book, you can go ahead and look there too. And I will be using the e-text at various times to show pictures, but I also have a lot of the pictures embedded in to the lecture notes, into the PDF lecture notes. So I'll be drawing on those and writing on them. So feel free to stop the video at any time if I'm going too quickly, or back up. I'll try my best to spell things correctly and well, but I am using a Surface Pen, and so sometimes my writing is not the best, but I'll do my best to get you to learn this material. So we're going to jump right in to muscles. So I'm going to flip over here to the actual notes. This is just the cover page. So the first few pages here are just cover page info. So let's scroll past all that for the lecture notes. And I believe it starts on page 6. Nope, page 7. There we go. We're going to start with muscles and muscle tissue. Now, this beginning page is almost all review from intro biology. You did a little bit about tissue types back then, and you should remember some of the muscle stuff, but we'll go over all of it, and we're going to mostly be in the world of skeletal muscle for these first few lectures, and then we'll move later in the term to a cardiac muscle and a little bit of smooth as well. So first thing, general characteristics. Probably know most of these general characteristics. The first one is, what do muscles do? They move parts of our body. We know that. That's the first most important thing to talk about here. And so I'm going to bring my highlighter up and do some highlighting of things. All right. So all movements of the body, right? That is what muscles do. Especially skeletal muscles use the bony framework for leverage. So the muscles and the bones work together to move the body. Now, we don't just move the body exteriorly, we move it and move it around in our environment. We move things interiorly as well. And so our muscles cause movement of fluids and other substances through internal body organs, specifically cardiac and smooth muscles. Okay? And to a lesser extent, some skeletal muscle too, and we'll talk about that later. Muscle is dense tissue, and it makes up about 50% of our total body weight, so it's a lot of our body weight. Now, there are 3 types of muscle tissue. You probably remember this: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. And these all differ in certain things. There are some similarities, and there are some differences. Now, you can find descriptions in your book on page 280 and 281, and if we flip over really quickly to the text, you can see here there's some skeletal muscle description, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and then they have also characteristics and muscle functions. There is a picture on page 281 that is very similar to the 3 pictures that we have here on the notes. So I'm not going to use that picture. I might as well use the ones that are right here, and we'll go from there. But I will make a little note here, just so if you want to go to your book, it's pages 280 and 281 that this material is covered over. All right, so let's see here. Let's zoom in just enough so we can see everything. All right, so skeletal muscle. You see here skeletal muscle is on the right here, and you can see that it is all in parallel. Lots of cells that are in parallel. Each one of those little lines going across is a muscle fiber or a cell. Okay? And so the tissue is composed of long, cylindrical, multinucleated, and parallel fibers. So where are the nuclei? Well, look at the little picture right here where it says nuclei, and you can see there are these little purple lines, and they're off to the sides, they're above and below, and they're on the edges of the muscle fiber. And you'll notice that for each fiber that goes across the whole length, you'll see multiple nuclei. All right. And you'll also see striations. And striations are the lines that are going up and down. And it's a band-like appearance that you see. And those striations hint at the mechanisms that cause contraction to occur. So we'll look at what those striations actually are composed of later as we get farther along in these lectures. Another really important thing is that skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means that you can consciously contract it. You have a direct link from your brain to via nerves to this muscle, and you can consciously contract it. So if I want to take my tea that I have here at the table and I bring it up to my mouth and take a drink, I consciously moved skeletal muscle to do that. We can contract them so only some of the fibers contract and exert ounces of force, or we can contract all the fibers at one time and get pounds of force. They do fatigue quickly, relatively speaking, as compared to smooth and cardiac muscle. Now, what that means is that they will use up ATP very fast, and if we don't keep supplying it with ATP and oxygen, they will fatigue. Cardiac and smooth need to work kind of all the time, and so they are a little better at utilizing their ATP and oxygen, and they can contract for extremely long periods of time. Now, in the case of cardiac muscle, obviously it needs to contract for your whole life. It will contract, take a short break, contract, take a short break, contract. So the cardiac muscle is obviously only found in the heart. It is shorter, not as long of fibers, and they are branched. And you can see over here, there's a couple that are branched. Let's see if I can show you, if we zoom in here, you can kind of see, let's see, where's one that kind of branches off? Well, this one right here kind of branches like that and like that. So there's an example of a branching, and this one right here branches in this direction like this and like that. So there's some different branching that we see. They are uninucleated mostly. They often start out as binucleated, and then they a certain percentage turn to uninucleated as they age. So I usually just say bi or uninucleated. Whoops, let's erase that. Bi or uninucleated. And they also have these striations, which you can see going up and down. Now, one thing that's different is at the ends of them, you're going to see these intercalated discs, and they have specialized junctions, and these are gap junctions. And you might remember those from your intro bio. Gap junctions allow ions to move from one cell to another cell by little pores that are in between. And so you can see here's the intercalated disc pictures, those little dark lines. Those are at the ends of the cells, and there are gap junctions in there. So ions and other small chemicals can move through those gap junctions. And this is really important because our muscles the heart muscle needs to kind of contract all at one time, and all the muscles need to contract in sync. And so these gap junctions kind of help with that process. Cardiac muscle is involuntary, meaning that you can't consciously speed up your heart muscle right now to 120 beats per minute. You could do that indirectly by going for a run, and then your body will increase the heart rate, but you can't just think my heart rate should be higher and it will go up higher. So it's involuntary processes that do cardiac muscle. The other thing that's very interesting is they have pacemaker cells, and we'll talk more about these later, but they beat on their own without any outside help, and they tend to depolarize on their own without any stimulus sometime around 70 to 80 beats per minute, sometimes even higher. And we'll talk a little bit later when we get to heart about how all that works. But that's a unique feature of cardiac. Smooth muscle is our third one. And smooth muscle is a muscle that we see in our viscera, in our organs, and in our tissues. And it looks very different. And you can kind of see right away, and I'm going to zoom in here, that the cells look really different. And I'm going to pretend that I can draw one in. And we're going to just pick one of these. And what we really see is a really thin, tiny fiber that's like that. All right. And notice each time that I drew one, you're seeing a nucleus there in the center. So they are uninucleated. And let's zoom back out. All right, and slide over. You can see both things again. So each one is got a shape which we call spindle-shaped, like kind of like a needle-like shape, or fusiform is another word for it. And they always have one nucleus in the center, and there's no striations. Notice there's no striations there. We always see these in hollow internal organ walls, like our blood vessels, BV, or our stomach, small intestine, things like that. And these are also involuntary. Now, just as the cardiac muscle needs to contract all the time and it doesn't seem to fatigue, smooth muscle is very tireless as well, and it has slow, sustained contractions that happen kind of continually, or it can do that. So that's an important point. So you definitely want to know the difference between all of these and be able to understand what's different about them. So, making a chart and saying which ones are voluntary, which ones are involuntary, which ones have striations, which ones don't have striations. That's a great way to study this material. So hopefully most of that was review. So now what we want to get to next is talk about characteristics of muscles. And a lot of this is just some terminology so we understand some words that we may use later. So let's just kind of jump right in and do a few of those. So first is excitability, sometimes called irritability. And this is the ability of the muscle tissue to receive and respond to stimuli. So basically saying that we can send an action potential or give a chemical or hormonal signal to the muscle, and it will create its own action potential that moves down its own membrane and will cause contraction to occur. We'll talk about how all that works later. Next, we have contractility. Now, contractility means that it can shorten forcibly, so the muscle can get smaller. And that's really what muscle tissue does, is it shortens. That's its main job, is to shorten. So that's super important, and we'll talk about how that contraction works in all the different muscle types as we go through them. Now, extensibility is next. This is also really important because the ability of the muscle to stretch beyond its resting length. Okay, so this is stretched when relaxed, of course. We couldn't stretch if we are contracted. And this is important because the muscles can stretch and can adapt kind of to their environment and get a little longer when they need to, and then they can contract back and get shorter again. So it's really important that it does that. Think of like a spring, or if you know the slinky toy can extend out, can stretch, and then when you let go of it, it will go back to its original length, but we can also push it farther together and contract it, right? Well, that stretching it and going back to its original length is our last one here, elasticity. The ability of a muscle to return to its original length after being stretched. So again, if you think of a spring or like a slinky toy, we can contract them, push them closer together. We can stretch them, and when we let go, they snap back to their original shape. So your muscles can do exactly the same thing, okay? And as it notes here, the main function is contraction, though, right? That's the primary function. Now, there are other main functions that muscles do, meaning kind of more global functions. So we know they contract, but by contracting, what are they doing for us? Well, there are 4 of them, and they're all listed there. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's start with movement. Movement is motion of the body. We already know this. Walking, movement, bringing coffee up to your mouth or tea up to your mouth to drink, talking. And then there's less noticeable movements that we have, which are like blood circulation. These are internal ones, food digestion, movements of other fluids, and then even movements like movements of my mouth right now, the muscles to make noise and sound. So lots of different movement. Almost every movement in your body is due to muscles in some way. Next, we have posture maintenance. Posture maintenance is the ongoing skeletal muscle contractions of postural muscles, and especially in the back, but all over. And they're constantly adjusting, and they're keeping body in stationary position. So if you're sitting right now, you have muscles that are contracting and relaxing very subtly to keep you in that sitting position. And sometimes some muscle fibers will contract, and then they'll relax, and other ones nearby will contract and give those first muscle fibers a break. So this is a good way to hold a position for a long period of time and allow the muscle to be contracted, but to maybe not contract every single muscle fiber at the same time. Then we get to our third one here, heat production. Now, you may remember this from intro bio as well. When we do, when we create when we make ATP and we use that ATP to do things, we often have heat as a byproduct. Most reactions of our body are not super efficient. They might only be 25-30% efficient. So muscle contraction produces heat due to its inefficiency. All right, but this is a good thing. This isn't bad because it helps maintain normal body temperature. Our body temperature is warmer than the environment in most cases, right? Think of Fahrenheit 98.6 degrees, something like that, 38 degrees Celsius is what we want to maintain. And most of the time, the outside air is less. And we need to have that warm body temperature so our enzymes will work efficiently and our body fluids will move through our body efficiently. And so this heat that is produced by the muscles is actually great because some of it warms our body and maintains normal body temperature. And a lot of the energy produced by muscles are heat. And we notice this when we work out and our body is much warmer than it was before. Our muscles actually feel warm to the touch. And about 30% of that is used for the contraction process. The last one is joint stability. And muscle tone is the most important aspect of joint stability. We talked about this when we talked about joints. We need to have that muscle slightly contracted to hold the joint in place and to stabilize movement. And so that's a really important thing. Now, we're going to talk just for a second about the kind of large picture of skeletal muscles. We're not going to go into a lot of detail of this. There's all different shapes, sizes, and numbers of muscle, and they all have different names and shapes and ways that we can describe them. And we're going to do most of this stuff in lab. All right, so we'll make a little note that in lab, you're going to look at all the different sizes and shapes and names of muscles. And we're going to not do most of that in lecture. We're going to keep that kind of separate. All muscles are discrete organs. Remember, an organ has 2 or more tissue types working together to do a certain function. And so each muscle does a certain function, but it has muscle tissue. That's one of the tissue types, but it also has connective tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue. It has really all the different tissue types in it. What I do want to talk about, though, a little bit is connective tissue wrapping. And you're also going to look at this in lab. So you'll get a chance to see this under the microscope in the lab assignments as well. And this is on page 282 of your notes. And let's see, the picture that we have is the exact same one, I think. But let's bring up page 282 so you can see it. Oops, I have to go to the next section there. I think. Yeah, there it is right there. So we're going to talk about this. This is figure 9.1 on page 282, but I'm going to go back to our notes because it's right there in our notes. So, but let's go ahead and write in just so if you make a note here, you can go back to your book later, page 282. Okay, So we're going to look at the 3 different layers or wrappings of connective tissue that go around the muscle. All right, and the first one, we're going to start from the outside and go inside, okay? And so the first one is the epimysium. Whoops, let's get rid of that and put it on highlighter. Okay. Now, if you look at the picture, you can see that the epimysium, which is also right there, kind of goes and forms the tendon that attaches to the bone. And so it's got this, it's dense fibrous connective tissue. That's what the DFCT is referring to. And it wraps the entire muscle, okay? And it often becomes a tendon or another attachment. So it's the outermost one, and as it kind of binds together, it will go and lock into a bone, or it might connect to other connective tissue or another muscle section. So the next one is perimysium. Now, perimysium is the middle section, and in perimysium, we are wrapping specific sections of muscle, which are bundles or fascicles. This perimysium is actually an invagination of the epimysium, which means that when it's created, it kind of the epimysium kind of dives in and kind of goes around the different fascicles and creates the perimysium. Now, real quickly, we've seen these prefixes before, epi, peri, and endo, when we were talking about nerves and how we wrap nerves. So we had the epineurium and the perineurium and the endoneurium. So the exact same thing is happening here. Perimysium is dividing the muscle into fascicles. Perineurium divided the nerves into fascicles. So everything is almost exactly the same, which is great. Our third one is endomysium. And this separates muscle cells. And a muscle cell, so like if you look over here, here's an individual muscle fiber, but that's also a muscle cell. So when you hear the word muscle fiber, that's one cell of the muscle. And wrapped around that, right here, right around it, is the endomysium. All right? So it separates muscle cell fibers and wraps them individually. This is also an invagination, but of the perimysium. So as we go down, this connective tissue gets a little thinner and less dense, but we have all these wrappings. So we have the epimysium, the perimysium, and the endomysium. Okay, so that's kind of important. And one other thing, it says the tissue around the endomysium contains a capillary network because we need to bring blood into the cells. And it contains myosatellite cells. And I'm going to just highlight these. These are single stem cells that don't fuse during development. So they're stem cells, so they can help with muscle repair. Generally, we don't make a lot of new muscle. We can increase the size of our muscle by the diameter getting larger and some of the things in the cells getting bigger. But we can, in some cases, create new muscle. And then there are, of course, nerve fibers to send messages to the muscle. So lots of stuff going on in these muscles. So what about these nerves in the blood supply? Well, the thing that's interesting is that there are neuronal connections to individual muscle cells, which means that each muscle cell can kind of contract on its own. It's not quite that way, but it's close. We have really, really fine control over our muscles because we can contract some muscle cells or fibers and relax or keep others uncontracted. So that's pretty interesting. And then, of course, we need to get large amounts of oxygen and nutrients provided by the arteries and to send out metabolic waste by at least one vein in and out of our muscles. So we have to have a lot of blood vessels, capillaries, branching in and out. Attachments. Now, we kind of mentioned tendons a minute ago, so let's talk about those and talk about some of the other things. The connective tissue that's surrounding the muscle is continuous with the tendon or aponeurosis. So what are those? A tendon is a cord-shaped connective tissue, which is dense, regular connective tissue. And if you remember, all of the collagen fibers are kind of in parallel in dense, regular connective tissue, and it gives really good one-directional strength. All right, so that's what tendons do. Aponeuroses, on the other hand, are broad and flat connective tissue that's more like a sheet, and that's dense, irregular connective tissue. That's what the DICT means there. All right, and this has a multi-directional pull. So you see the little I right there. And so like a sheet, we could kind of pull the sheet in all directions and it would kind of hold itself together. It's not quite as strong as a tendon in one direction. We could, if we pulled on the aponeurosis in one direction really, really hard, we might rip the sheet. But it works pretty well. And so some muscles that need to have a flat and broad connection have aponeuroses, and other ones that tend to pull in one direction have tendons. So a lot of the muscles in our appendicular skeleton have tendons because they're usually pulling in one direction to flex our body or to the arm or to extend the arm, where we see aponeuroses more in our axial skeleton, where we're maybe doing movements that aren't always in one direction but are more multidirectional. So muscle attachments. Again, you're going to cover this a little more in lab than lecture, but let's at least just define a few terms here. The attachment points of the muscles. So if you saw back up this picture, the tendon was attached here to the bone at some point. That attachment can have a different name. And so we have origins and insertions. And origins are the immovable portion of the bone, and insertions are the more movable portions. So what usually happens is when the muscle contracts, the insertion is somewhere on the other side of a joint, and it moves something towards the origin. All right, and so the origin tends to be more stable and immovable, and the insertion part comes to it. So if you think of your bicep for a second, you have different muscles in your bicep, and you have your bicep brachii, which goes and it spans across your, let's see if I can show you here. So here's my bicep right there, and it attaches up here into the shoulder area, and it also attaches across, let's see if I can do this, across the joint down here into the forearm. So the origin is up here, the insertion is down here. So when I contract and I flex, this insertion moves towards the origin. The origin stays stable, and this insertion moves towards it when I do this kind of action here like that. All right? So that's an example of origins and insertions. And there are some exceptions, and you have to learn some of these origin insertions in lab, but we won't cover them too much more in lecture. We can have direct connections or indirect connections. So when the epimysium goes directly to a bone or to cartilage, periosteum or perichondrium, we call it direct. Indirectly, if the connective tissue of the muscle goes to some of the fascia that surrounds the muscle and doesn't go directly into a cartilage or bone, then we call it indirect. And that's and these terms we use occasionally here in lecture, but you may use them a little bit more in lab. All right, I think I'm going to stop here because we're about to get into the microscopic anatomy. So this is a great place to stop. So when we come back to part 2, we're going to do microscopic anatomy, and we're going to be covering what the inside of the cell looks like, and we'll be talking about the beginnings of how muscles do contraction. Okay, great. So thanks so much. And again, if you have any questions, email your instructor. They will be able to answer those questions for you, or go see them in office hours, either online or in person. And I'll talk to you at the next lecture, and we'll continue with muscles. Thanks.